On August 18, 1944, a German staff car rolled slowly along a road near Metz in occupied France. In the back seat sat Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, one of Hitler's most experienced commanders, a man who had led armies across Poland, France, and Russia. He was 61 years old. He had served Germany for more than 4 decades, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would never reach Berlin alive. In his pocket was a letter addressed to Adolf Hitler. It was not a report, it was not a request, it was a confession and a plea, written by a man who had witnessed the destruction of everything he had spent his life building. The letter contained a single devastating admission that would echo through military history. In the face of total enemy air superiority, von Kluge had written, "We can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air, except to retire from the battlefield." 700 miles away, in his headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Hitler sat surrounded by maps and advisors who told him what he wanted to hear. He had dismissed von Kluge 2 days earlier, convinced the field marshal was either incompetent or a traitor. Hitler still believed that willpower could overcome any material disadvantage. He still believed that German soldiers, properly motivated, could defeat any enemy. He still believed that his generals were defeatists who lacked the courage to fight. Von Kluge's letter would prove him catastrophically wrong. The man who wrote that letter had spent his entire life preparing for war. Günther Adolf Ferdinand von Kluge was born on October 30, 1882, in Posen, Prussia, into an aristocratic military family. His father had served as a lieutenant general in the First World War. Young Günther was commissioned into the German Army's 46th Field Artillery Regiment in 1901, beginning a career that would span more than 4 decades. He attended the prestigious Kriegsakademie, the German War Academy, from 1909 to 1912, then served on the general staff before the First World War. During that conflict, he fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts, participating in the Battle of Verdun in 1916, where he was wounded. His nickname, Der Kluge Hans, meaning clever Hans, punned on his surname, since Klug means clever in German. It was an ironic reference to a famous performing horse that supposedly could do arithmetic. Those who knew von Kluge said the name fit. He was smart, capable, experienced. He was everything a field commander should be. By 1933, he had risen to Major General. By 1940, he commanded the Fourth Army during the invasion of France, leading the advance that helped knock the French out of the war in 6 weeks. On the Eastern Front, he commanded Army Group Center, the formation aimed directly at Moscow. He had seen more combat than most generals alive. He had earned the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest military decorations, and now, on a road in France, he was about to swallow poison because he had told Hitler the truth. The collision between Hitler's fantasy and von Kluge's reality had been building for years. It began with a fundamental misunderstanding of what air power had become and what it would mean for the war Germany was fighting. In the years before the invasion of France, Hitler had constructed an elaborate mythology around the Atlantic Wall. This chain of fortifications, stretching from Norway to Spain, was supposed to make Europe impregnable. Concrete bunkers, artillery positions, beach obstacles, and minefields would stop any invasion on the beaches. Hitler called it the greatest fortress in history. He believed it would hold. His generals were not so certain. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, assigned to strengthen the coastal defences in late 1943, understood something Hitler did not. Rommel had fought the British and Americans in North Africa. He had experienced what it meant to operate under skies controlled by the enemy. He knew that the Atlantic Wall was an illusion if Germany could not contest control of the air above it. Rommel tried to explain this to Hitler in reports and personal meetings. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, he wrote, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. The comparison was stark. German soldiers, the finest trained military force in Europe, would be reduced to primitives, facing a technological civilization they could not match. Hitler dismissed these warnings as defeatism. He had heard similar complaints before, on the Eastern Front, in North Africa, in Italy. His generals always wanted more men, more tanks, and more aircraft. They always said the situation was impossible, and yet Germany had survived. Hitler attributed this survival to his own will, his refusal to accept defeat, his insistence that his commanders stand and fight rather than retreat. What Hitler failed to understand was that the situation in France would be fundamentally different from anything Germany had faced before. The Americans and British had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. They had built an air force of unprecedented size and capability, and they had systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies over Europe. The destruction of German air power began long before the first Allied soldier set foot on the beaches of Normandy. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, American heavy bombers struck deep into Germany, targeting aircraft factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks. The Luftwaffe rose to defend the Reich and was methodically annihilated in a battle of attrition that Germany could not win. The numbers tell the story of a catastrophe unprecedented in aerial warfare. From January through June of 1944, 2,262 German fighter pilots died in combat. In May alone, 1/4 of Germany's entire fighter pilot force perished. These were not novice pilots who could be quickly replaced. These were experienced veterans who had accumulated hundreds of combat hours, men whose skills had been honed through years of aerial warfare. When they died, their expertise died with them. The training programs that might have produced replacements took months to complete, and Germany did not have months to spare. The American strategy was brutal but effective. Long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, accompanied bomber formations deep into Germany. When Luftwaffe fighters rose to attack the bombers, the Mustangs engaged them. The Germans faced an impossible choice. If they attacked the bombers, the escorts would destroy them. If they avoided combat, the bombers would destroy their factories and fuel supplies. Either way, Germany lost. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow of its former power. The air force that had conquered Poland in days, that had driven the British from France, that had terrorized London during the Blitz, could no longer defend its own homeland. The skies over Germany belonged to the Allies, and when the invasion came, the skies over France would belong to them as well. The scale of Allied air power assembled for the Normandy invasion defied comprehension. More than 13,000 aircraft were available for operations on June 6, 1944. Against this armada, the Luftwaffe could muster approximately 815 aircraft in all of France and the Low Countries. The disparity was not a difference in degree. It was a difference in kind. It was the difference between an air force and the absence of one. On D-Day itself, Allied aircraft flew 14,674 sorties over the invasion beaches and the surrounding areas. German aircraft managed 319. The ratio was 45-1. In practical terms, this meant that Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen operated under a protective umbrella that made German air attack virtually impossible. Meanwhile, German forces on the ground faced constant harassment from aircraft they could neither escape nor effectively engage. The Luftwaffe's absence was noticed immediately by German commanders struggling to respond to the invasion. Reinforcements that should have moved during daylight were forced to travel at night, slowing their arrival by days. Columns that attempted to advance in daytime were attacked within minutes of being spotted. Staff cars carrying senior officers became death traps. Communication lines were cut by strafing fighters. Headquarters were bombed before they could issue orders. The entire command structure of the German army in France was being systematically degraded by an enemy that operated with complete impunity. Within days of the invasion, German generals began reporting a situation they had never experienced before. Field Marshal Rommel, whose forces bore the brunt of the initial assault, sent message after message to headquarters describing the paralysis caused by Allied air supremacy. Our own operations are rendered extraordinarily difficult and in part impossible to carry out, he reported on June 12, owing to the exceptionally strong and, in some respects, overwhelming superiority of the enemy air force. Rommel understood what this meant for the campaign. Germany could not win a battle of attrition against an enemy who could move, supply, and reinforce his forces freely while German forces were pinned in place. The only hope was to defeat the invasion quickly, before Allied material superiority became overwhelming. But Allied air power made rapid German operations impossible. Every attempt to concentrate forces for a counterattack was detected and attacked before it could begin. The toll on German leadership illustrated the mortal danger of operating under Allied air supremacy. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps defending the invasion beaches, was killed by an Allied air attack on June 12. General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Division was shot dead by American paratroopers on June 6, when his staff car was ambushed near his headquarters. General Heinz Hellmich was killed on June 17. General Rudolf Stegmann died on June 18. General Leo Gehr von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, was badly wounded on June 10 when Allied aircraft destroyed his headquarters based on intelligence from decoded German communications. The most significant casualty came on July 17, 1944. Field Marshal Rommel was returning from a frontline inspection when Allied fighters spotted his staff car near the village of Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. The aircraft attacked. Rommel's driver, Sergeant Carl Daniel, was gravely wounded, his left arm torn off by cannon fire. He would die later that night, despite receiving a blood transfusion. The car crashed into a ditch. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle, suffering severe skull fractures that would end his combat career. The most famous German general in France was removed from command by two aircraft that probably never knew who they had hit. German soldiers developed their own vocabulary for the terror from above. They called the Allied fighter bombers Jabos, short for Jagdbomber. They spoke of Jabo Todd, death by fighter bomber. They learned to freeze at the sound of aircraft engines, to dive for cover at the first glimpse of wings against the sky, to move only at night when the hunting aircraft could not find them. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced Soviet armor and artillery without flinching, reported that nothing in their experience had prepared them for the psychological strain of constant air attack. The primary instruments of this terror were the American P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Hawker Typhoon. The P-47 was a massive aircraft, weighing more than most fighters of its era, powered by a 2,000 horsepower engine that gave it devastating speed and climb. It carried 850 caliber machine guns and could haul 2,500 pounds of bombs or rockets beneath its wings. American pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. German soldiers called it something far less affectionate. During the course of the war, P-47 Thunderbolts flew more than 746,000 sorties. They achieved a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 in aerial combat, but their true impact was in ground attack missions. From D-Day to the end of the war in Europe, P-47 pilots claimed the destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. Post-war analysis showed that pilots routinely over-claimed their kills, sometimes by a factor of 10 or more. But even accounting for such over-claiming, the damage inflicted was enormous. These attacks represented a relentless assault on the lifeblood of the German war machine, the supplies and reinforcements that never reached the front. The Typhoon was equally fearsome. Armed with 420mm cannon and 8 rocket projectiles, it could destroy a tank with a single pass. The 60-pound warheads on its rockets could penetrate armor that would stop machine gun fire. The British developed a system called cab rank, maintaining standing patrols of Typhoons over the battlefield. Forward air controllers on the ground could call these aircraft onto targets within minutes. A German column that was moving freely one moment could be burning wreckage the next. The cost of operating the Typhoon was severe. During the Normandy campaign alone, 151 Typhoon pilots died in action, lost in less than 3 months of combat. The aircraft was fast but not maneuverable. It was heavily armed but vulnerable to ground fire. Pilots who pressed their attacks too closely paid the price. But their sacrifice made German ground operations nearly impossible. The psychological impact of constant air attack was as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers reported that they could not eat, could not sleep, could not rest. The sound of aircraft engines triggered panic responses that officers struggled to control. Even hardened combat veterans broke down under the relentless pressure from the sky. They developed what medical officers called air attack neurosis, a condition that rendered them incapable of functioning as soldiers. Lieutenant General Bodo Zimmermann, Chief Operations Officer of Army Group D, documented the paralysis in official reports. The whole of the area through which divisions must march was being most intensively patrolled by the Allied air forces, he wrote. No road movement by day was possible in view of this air umbrella, which reached from Normandy to the Paris area. His words captured a reality that German commanders had never faced before. An entire army was trapped, unable to move, unable to concentrate, unable to respond to enemy attacks, because the sky belonged to someone else. This was the situation that Field Marshal Günther von Kluge inherited when he arrived in France in early July 1944. Hitler had dismissed Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the previous Supreme Commander West, for defeatism. When Rundstedt had been asked what Germany should do, he had replied with brutal honesty. "Make peace, you fools," he said. "What else can you do?" Hitler wanted a commander who would fight, not one who would surrender. He chose von Kluge, a general who had served loyally on the Eastern Front, and who, Hitler believed, would bring the necessary determination to the Western theatre. Von Kluge arrived believing what Hitler believed. He thought Rommel and Rundstedt had been too pessimistic, too quick to accept defeat. He had commanded Army Group Center on the Eastern Front, where the situation had often seemed impossible, and Germany had survived through determination and skill. He expected to find similar opportunities in the West, situations that looked hopeless but could be salvaged through aggressive action and superior German tactics. His confidence lasted approximately 3 days. After touring the front lines, after seeing the devastation caused by Allied air attacks, after speaking with commanders who had been fighting under these conditions for a month, von Kluge understood that everything Hitler believed was wrong. On July 12, he told General Alfred Jodl at Hitler's headquarters, "The truth. I am no pessimist," he said, "but in my view, the situation could not be grimmer." 5 days later, Rommel was wounded, and von Kluge assumed command of both Army Group B and the overall Western Command. He now held complete responsibility for a situation that was deteriorating faster than anyone in Berlin understood, and he had no power to change the fundamental reality that made German defeat inevitable. The Allies controlled the sky. The crisis came on July 25, 1944, when the Americans launched Operation Cobra. The plan was simple in concept but unprecedented in execution. American ground forces had been stalled in the hedgerow country of Normandy for weeks, suffering heavy casualties for minimal gains. The bocage, as the French called it, was a nightmare for attackers. Ancient hedgerows, some of them centuries old, divided the landscape into thousands of small fields. Each hedgerow provided perfect defensive positions for German soldiers with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. American tanks could not push through the dense vegetation. Infantry that tried to advance were cut down before they could reach the German positions. General Omar Bradley proposed using air power to blast a hole through the German lines that tanks and infantry could exploit. The bombing would be concentrated on a rectangular area approximately 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep between the towns of Montreuil and Hébécrevant, northwest of Saint-Lô. Everything in that rectangle would be destroyed, creating a gap through which American armor could pour. The aircraft assembled for Operation Cobra represented the largest concentration of tactical air power in history to that point. Approximately 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, would lead the assault. 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers would follow. Nearly 500 escort fighters would protect the force and attack targets of opportunity. In total, they would drop more than 4,000 tons of bombs on an area roughly the size of a large university campus. Directly in the target zone sat the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the finest armoured formations in the German army. The division's name came from its origins in the army's armour schools, Lehr meaning teaching in German. Its ranks were filled with experienced instructor tankers, men who had trained others to fight and who represented some of the Wehrmacht's best qualified armoured troops. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, had served as Rommel's chief of staff in Africa. His division was supposed to be the steel wall that would stop any American breakthrough. The bombing began at 9:40 on the morning of July 25 after a one-day delay caused by poor weather. For the next 2 hours, wave after wave of aircraft passed over the German positions. Heavy bombers released their loads from high altitude. Medium bombers came in lower. Fighter bombers dove to attack anything that moved. The earth shook. Smoke and dust rose thousands of feet into the air. The sound was audible for dozens of miles. Bayerlein survived to describe what happened. The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, he reported. Back and forth the carpets were laid. Artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened. All roads and tracks destroyed. By midday, the entire area resembled a moonscape, with the bomb craters touching rim to rim. There was approximately 5,000 bombs per square kilometre. Nothing above ground could survive such concentration. The effect on German soldiers was beyond anything Bayerlein had witnessed in years of combat. All signal communications had been cut and no command was possible, he continued. The shock effect on the troops was indescribable. Several of my men went mad and rushed round in the open until they were cut down by splinters. Others lay completely stunned in their foxholes, unable to move or respond to orders. The psychological destruction was as complete as the physical devastation. When von Kluge demanded that Bayerlein hold his position at all costs, the general's response captured the reality of what had happened. "My grenadiers and my pioneers and my anti-tank gunners are holding," he said. "They are lying in their holes, still and mute, because they are dead." There was nothing left to command. The Panzer Lehr Division, which had entered the battle with approximately 2,200 combat troops and 45 operational tanks, was effectively destroyed. After the bombing, Bayerlein reported that 70% of his personnel were out of action, dead, wounded, driven insane, or rendered incapable of functioning. Only 7 to 12 tanks remained operational. An elite armoured division, one of the best in the entire German army, had been annihilated in less than 3 hours by aircraft dropping bombs from thousands of feet above the battlefield. The American ground forces that advanced after the bombing found German defences shattered. Within days, the breakthrough became a breakout. General George Patton's Third Army poured through the gap and began racing across France at a pace that stunned both sides. The static warfare that had characterized the first 7 weeks of the Normandy campaign was over. Now it became a pursuit, and German forces had no answer. Hitler's response to this catastrophe was to order a counterattack. On August 2, he commanded von Kluge to concentrate 8 panzer divisions for an assault westward toward Avranches. The goal was to cut off Patton's forces from their supply lines and restore the defensive line that had been shattered by Operation Cobra. Von Kluge knew the order was insane. The divisions Hitler demanded did not exist at full strength. Most were shadows of their former selves, worn down by weeks of fighting and constant air attack. The roads they would have to use were under constant air surveillance. Any concentration of armour would be spotted and attacked within hours. He recommended withdrawal to the Seine River, where German forces might establish a defensible line while they rebuilt their strength. Hitler refused. The attack would proceed as ordered. Operation Lüttich, as the counterattack was called, began on the night of August 6, 1944. 4 panzer divisions with approximately 177 tanks and assault guns between them advanced toward the town of Mortain. This was far fewer than the 8 divisions Hitler had demanded, but it was everything von Kluge could scrape together. Initial progress was encouraging. Ground fog concealed the advancing columns from Allied aircraft. German tanks captured Mortain and pushed to within a few miles of Avranches. Then the fog lifted. What followed became known as the Day of the Typhoon. At approximately noon on August 7, the weather cleared and Allied aircraft discovered the German columns strung out along the roads leading to Avranches. Within minutes, squadrons of Typhoons and P-47s were diving on the exposed armour. The Royal Air Force 2nd Tactical Air Force flew nearly 300 Typhoon sorties that day, firing more than 2,000 rockets and dropping 80 tons of bombs. The American 9th Air Force added 400 more sorties. German tanks that had been advancing confidently in the morning were burning hulks by afternoon. The attack ground to a halt as crews abandoned their vehicles and fled for cover. General Hans Speidel, von Kluge's chief of staff, provided the definitive assessment. The armoured operation was completely wrecked exclusively by the Allied air forces, he reported. His conclusion left no room for ambiguity. The counterattack had not failed because of American ground resistance. It had not failed because of inadequate German planning or insufficient forces. It had failed because Allied aircraft made armoured operations in daylight impossible. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was equally clear about what had happened. The chief credit in smashing the enemy's spearhead must go to the rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, he wrote. The result of the strafing was that the enemy attack was effectively brought to a halt, and a threat was turned into a great victory. Von Kluge sent message after message to Hitler describing the situation. Each one made the same point in different words. We cannot move. We cannot concentrate. We cannot attack. Every attempt to advance is destroyed by aircraft before it can develop. The enemy controls the sky absolutely. Hitler responded by demanding that the attack continue. The failure at Mortain sealed the fate of German forces in Normandy. The panzer divisions that had been concentrated for the counterattack were now trapped in a narrowing pocket. To the north, British and Canadian forces pressed toward Falaise. To the south and east, American forces swung around in a great encircling movement. The Germans were being surrounded, and the same air power that had stopped their counterattack now made escape nearly impossible. The Falaise Pocket, as this encirclement became known, represented one of the greatest military disasters of the Second World War. Between August 12 and August 21, 1944, the remnants of two German armies struggled to escape through a narrowing gap, while Allied aircraft turned the roads into killing grounds. The scenes inside the pocket defied description. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, hundreds of tanks and armoured vehicles, thousands of trucks and horse-drawn wagons, all crammed into an area that shrank daily as Allied forces closed in. Roads became impassable with wrecked vehicles, fields filled with soldiers seeking cover from the endless air attacks, and overhead, constantly, the aircraft came. Wing Commander Desmond Scott of the Royal Air Force 486 Squadron flew missions over the pocket during its final days. The road was crammed with enemy vehicles, he reported, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, even horse-drawn wagons and ambulances, nose to tail, all in a frantic bid to reach cover. Scott described what happened when the Typhoons arrived. As I sped to the head of this mile-long column, hundreds of German troops began spilling out into the road to sprint for the open fields and hedgerows. There was no escape. Typhoons were already attacking in deadly swoops at the other end of the column, and within seconds the whole stretch of road was bursting and blazing under streams of rocket and cannon fire. Ammunition wagons exploded like multicolored volcanoes. The once proud ranks of Hitler's Third Reich were being massacred from the Normandy skies. The destruction continued for days. German soldiers who escaped the pocket reported scenes of apocalyptic horror. Dead men and dead horses carpeted the roads. Burned-out vehicles blocked every route. The stench of decomposing flesh made breathing difficult for miles around. Those who made it through did so by abandoning everything, their weapons, their vehicles, their wounded comrades, and fleeing on foot through fields and forests at night. The final toll was devastating. Between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers died in the pocket. Another 40,000 to 50,000 were captured. The Germans lost approximately 500 tanks, several hundred artillery pieces, and thousands of vehicles of all types. Two entire armies had been effectively destroyed in less than 2 weeks. General Dwight Eisenhower toured the battlefield 48 hours after the pocket was closed. His description became famous. The battlefield was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas, he wrote. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Von Kluge did not witness the final destruction of the pocket. On August 15, his staff car had been damaged in an Allied bombing raid while he was trying to coordinate the escape of his forces. For more than 12 hours, he was cut off from all communication with Hitler's headquarters. When contact was finally restored, Hitler was convinced that von Kluge had been trying to negotiate surrender with the Allies. On August 17, Field Marshal Walter Model arrived at von Kluge's headquarters with a personal note from Hitler. Von Kluge was relieved of command, effective immediately. He was ordered to return to Germany. Von Kluge understood what this summons meant. The Gestapo had been investigating the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler for nearly a month. Under torture, conspirators had named names. Von Kluge's chief of staff on the Eastern Front, Henning von Treschow, had been one of the plot's leaders. Von Kluge himself had known about the conspiracy, had sympathized with its goals, had waited to see if Hitler would die before committing himself. When Hitler survived, von Kluge had done nothing. Now that hesitation would cost him his life. The truth about von Kluge's relationship with Hitler was more complicated than simple loyalty or betrayal. On October 30, 1942, his 60th birthday, Hitler had sent von Kluge a personal letter accompanied by a check for 500,000 Reichsmarks from the German treasury, with promises to cover improvements to his family estate. Von Kluge had accepted the money. His chief of staff, von Treschow, had criticized him sharply for allowing himself to be bought. Hitler regarded such gifts as purchasing absolute loyalty. Von Kluge had taken the money and later sympathized with the men who wanted Hitler dead. It was characteristic of his fundamental indecisiveness, the quality that would define his final weeks. When conspirators approached him about the July 20th plot, von Kluge had reportedly said, "Ja, wenn das Schwein tot wäre," meaning yes, if the pig were dead. He would support the overthrow of the Nazi regime, but only if someone else took the risk of killing Hitler first. When the bomb exploded and Hitler survived, von Kluge immediately distanced himself from the plotters. He rescinded orders that General von Stülpnagel had given to arrest SS officers in Paris. He tried to pretend he had never known anything, but the Gestapo had records. Documents seized during the investigation connected him to the conspiracy, and his name appeared in the papers of arrested plotters. He spent August 18 writing. The letter to Hitler was his final testament, an attempt to explain what had happened in Normandy and why Germany had lost. It was also a plea for Hitler to accept reality and end the war before more German lives were wasted in a hopeless cause. The letter opened with an acknowledgement that von Kluge would soon be dead. "When you receive these lines, I shall be no more," he wrote. "I cannot bear the reproach that I have sealed the fate of the West through faulty measures, and I have no means of defending myself. I draw a conclusion from that and am dispatching myself, where already thousands of my comrades are. I have never feared death. Life has no more meaning for me." Then came the critical passages. Von Kluge did not blame his subordinates. He did not blame inadequate supplies or insufficient reinforcements. He blamed the strategic situation that Hitler had refused to acknowledge. Both Rommel and I, and probably all the commanders here in the West with experience of battle against the Anglo-Americans with their preponderance of material, foresaw the present development, von Kluge wrote. We were not listened to. Our appreciations were not dictated by pessimism, but from the sole knowledge of the facts. The letter then turned to the future. Von Kluge knew that Hitler would replace him with Model, a general known for his fanatical determination. He hoped Model might succeed where he had failed, but he feared the worst. "I do not know whether Field Marshal Model, who has been proved in every sphere, will still master the situation," von Kluge wrote. "From my heart I hope so. Should it not be so, however, and your new greatly desired weapons, especially those of the Air Force, not succeed, then, my Führer, make up your mind to end the war. The German people have undergone such untold suffering that it is time to put an end to this frightfulness." The letter closed with an expression of loyalty that was also a farewell. "I depart from you, my Führer, as one who stood nearer to you than you perhaps realized, in the consciousness that I did my duty to the utmost." Von Kluge then swallowed a cyanide capsule. He died in the back of his car somewhere between Metz and Verdun, on roads that German soldiers had fought over in another war 30 years before. The letter reached Hitler several days later. According to General Alfred Jodl, who was present when Hitler read it, The Führer showed no visible emotion. He passed the letter to Jodl without comment. Whatever thoughts Hitler had about von Kluge's final words, he kept to himself, but his actions spoke clearly enough. Von Kluge was denied military honours. The state funeral that had been announced was abruptly cancelled. When von Kluge was buried on September 1st at the small cemetery of Böhne near his wife's family estate, no representative of the German government attended. Hitler had erased him from history, or tried to. What Hitler could not erase was the truth of what von Kluge had written. In the face of total enemy air superiority, we can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air except to retire from the battlefield. This was not defeatism. This was not cowardice. This was the professional assessment of a commander who had spent his entire adult life studying and practicing warfare. The men who made Allied air superiority possible never became famous in the way that ground commanders did. Their names do not appear in most history books, but their contribution to victory was as great as any infantry division or armoured corps. The pilots who flew the missions over Normandy came from farms and factories across America and Britain. Many had never seen an airplane before the war. They learned to fly in training programs that compressed years of peacetime instruction into months of intensive preparation. They deployed to bases in England that had been carved out of farmers' fields. They flew missions over enemy territory knowing that any flight might be their last. Behind the pilots stood an army of ground crews who worked around the clock to keep the aircraft flying. Mechanics who could repair battle damage in hours. Armourers who loaded bombs and ammunition through the night. Fuel handlers who kept the tanks full. These were not glamorous jobs. They did not earn medals or headlines. But without them, not a single aircraft would have taken off. And behind the ground crews stood the factories that built the aircraft and the ships that carried them across the Atlantic. The P-47 Thunderbolts that devastated German columns at Mortain had been assembled in plants in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. The bombs they dropped had been manufactured in facilities across the American heartland. The fuel that powered them had been refined from oil pumped in Texas and Oklahoma, and shipped across an ocean still patrolled by German submarines. This was the system that Hitler never understood. He saw American industrial production as propaganda, exaggeration designed to intimidate Germany into surrender. He believed that German quality would overcome American quantity, that a smaller number of superior German weapons would defeat a larger number of inferior American ones. He was wrong about everything. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly 100,000 military aircraft per year. That single year's output exceeded Japan's total aircraft production for the entire war. The assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers who had never seen a factory before the war became skilled assemblers and welders. Women who had been told their place was in the home built the bombers that destroyed German cities and the fighters that swept the Luftwaffe from the sky. The German generals who fought against this industrial might recognize what Hitler refused to see. After the war, captured German officers were extensively debriefed about their experiences. Their testimony was remarkably consistent. The 12th Army Group Air Effects Committee, which compiled and analyzed German interrogations, concluded that from the high command to the soldier in the field, German opinion was agreed that air power was the most striking aspect of Allied superiority. Even Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister and one of the most fanatical Nazis, admitted the truth in his private diary. Again and again we return to the starting point of our conversation, he wrote in March 1945. Our whole military predicament is due to enemy air superiority. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruger, who served as Rommel's naval aide, captured the transformation in warfare that had occurred. Utilization of the Anglo-American air forces is the modern type of warfare, he observed, turning the flank not from the side but from above. Traditional military thinking focused on outmaneuvering enemies on the ground. The Allies had rendered such thinking obsolete by controlling the third dimension. Von Kluge's letter was not the only assessment of Allied air power written by a German commander. Similar conclusions appear in reports from dozens of generals who fought in Normandy, but von Kluge's letter has a unique power because of the circumstances under which it was written. This was a man facing certain death, writing to the leader he had served for years, telling him the truth without any possibility of personal benefit. There was nothing to gain by lying and nothing to lose by honesty. His words carry the weight of a final testament. The letter also matters because Hitler ignored it completely. In the months after von Kluge's death, German forces continued to fight under conditions of absolute Allied air supremacy. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 succeeded initially only because bad weather grounded Allied aircraft. When the skies cleared, the German offensive collapsed under the same aerial assault that had destroyed the Normandy counterattack. Hitler continued to promise miracle weapons that would restore German air superiority. The jet-powered Messerschmitt 262 was faster than any Allied fighter. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket struck England from beyond the reach of conventional air defences, but none of these weapons appeared in sufficient numbers to change the strategic balance. Germany had lost the war in the air, and no amount of technological innovation could compensate for the destruction of the Luftwaffe's pilot corps and the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied production. The war ended 9 months after von Kluge's death. Hitler killed himself in his bunker on April 30, 1945, still convinced that his generals had failed him rather than that his strategy had failed Germany. He never acknowledged that von Kluge's assessment had been correct. He never admitted that the warnings from Rommel and Rundstedt and all the other commanders who had begged him to face reality had been accurate. Von Kluge's grave lies in the small cemetery of Böhne, near the oak grove beside his wife's family mausoleum. After the war, the cemetery fell into East German territory. The communist authorities abandoned and eventually levelled it. Today, a simple memorial stone marks the approximate location where one of Germany's most experienced commanders was buried after telling Hitler the truth about American air power. The truth that von Kluge told has echoed through military history in the decades since. Every modern military force studies the Normandy campaign. Every Air Force Academy teaches the lessons of Allied air superiority. The doctrine that emerged from the summer of 1944, that air power can decide ground battles, that control of the sky enables everything else, and its absence prevents everything else, remains central to military thinking today. But perhaps the most important lesson is not about air power at all. It is about the cost of refusing to listen to expert advice. Hitler surrounded himself with subordinates who told him what he wanted to hear. He dismissed commanders who delivered unwelcome truths. He replaced professionals with ideologues and competent generals with loyal followers. The result was catastrophe, on a scale that destroyed his nation and cost tens of millions of lives. Von Kluge was not a perfect man. He had accepted money from Hitler, gifts that compromised his independence. He had known about the assassination plot and done nothing to either support it or stop it. He had served a regime that committed unspeakable crimes, but in his final letter he told the truth to power when telling the truth could not possibly benefit him. He wrote what he knew to be correct, even though he knew he would be dead before anyone read it. "Make up your mind to end the war," he urged Hitler. "The German people have undergone such untold suffering that it is time to put an end to this frightfulness." Hitler did not listen. The war continued for 9 more months. Millions more people died. Germany was utterly destroyed, its cities reduced to rubble, its population starving, its territory divided between occupying powers. Everything that von Kluge predicted came to pass. The Field Marshal's assessment of Allied air power proved accurate in every particular. His conclusion that Germany could not compensate for enemy air superiority, except by retreating from the battlefield, was validated by every engagement from Normandy to the Rhine to the final collapse. His plea for Hitler to accept reality and end the suffering was ignored, with consequences that continue to shape the world today. History remembers Hitler as the dictator who led Germany to destruction. It remembers Rommel as the Desert Fox, the legendary commander wounded by the air power he had warned about. It remembers Patton and Eisenhower and Montgomery as the victorious Allied generals. It should also remember Günther von Kluge, not as a hero, for he was not one, not as a martyr, for his death served no cause but his own escape from punishment, but as a witness, a man who saw the truth about American air power and wrote it down, knowing he would die for other reasons before anyone could punish him for honesty. A man whose final letter to Hitler contained perhaps the most succinct and accurate assessment of why Germany lost the battle for France. In the face of total enemy air superiority, we can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air, except to retire from the battlefield. Those words were written 80 years ago by a man who knew he had only hours to live. They remain as relevant today as they were in August of 1944. Air power had transformed warfare. The nation that controlled the sky controlled the battlefield, and no amount of courage or determination or tactical brilliance could overcome that fundamental reality. Hitler refused to accept this truth. Von Kluge died knowing it. The difference between them was the difference between fantasy and reality, between ideology and evidence, between a leader who demanded loyalty to his delusions and commanders who could see what was actually happening on the ground and in the sky above it. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their descendants to history enthusiasts of every background. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.